Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Coffee, Crime, and Crafts. Today's episode is not going to cover an unsolved murder, but an act of vigilante justice that took place on the island of Grand Manan in July of 2006. This incident culminated in assaults, a shootout in the middle of a quiet neighborhood street, and a fire that burned a house to the ground. So I have my dark roast coffee all set to enjoy in my Disney mug. And today my craft of choice is going to be this pair of socks I've been working on. I completed the first sock a while ago, and I've just picked up the second sock in an effort to get that one done. It's a good opportunity to get a few rows completed. So what can I tell you about this? The sock yarn that I'm using is a loops and thread yarn from Michaels. It's called a Perfect Pair. It's a combination of bamboo, polyester, and nylon, I believe. This is in the colorway River. The pattern I'm using is the super simple cuff down sock that was designed by Louise Patterson of Wildflower Wool. This is a really basic vanilla sock pattern. It's easy to follow. I keep a track of my rows because I want both of my socks to match up and be the same length for the leg by the time I get to the point where I need to turn the heel. I typically use 2.5 millimeter needles, and I either use this set of double pointed needles like I'm using today, or I also knit them on a set of circular needles using the magic loop method. The first sock I knit magic loop. The second one I'm knitting on the double pointed needles. So grab your drink and your craft of choice and let's get to this week's crime. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about the setting. Grand Manan is an island located in the Bay of Fundy, approximately 32 kilometers south of Black's Harbor, New Brunswick, in the province of New Brunswick. This island is just about 34 kilometers long. It's 18 kilometers wide, with most of the inhabitants living on the eastern side of the island. Their economy relies mostly on fishing, agriculture, tourism, and the village itself has a population of around 2,300, give or take. For all intents and purposes, it's a small, very tight-knit community. I'll see what I did there. Pun intended. That is until a man by the name of Ronald Ross moved in. Ross was originally from the neighboring province of Nova Scotia, I believe. He moved into a residence at number 40 Cedar Street on Grand Manan Island, and he worked from time to time on the Grand Manan lobster boats. His neighbor was a man named Carter Foster. He lived across the street with his girlfriend, Sarah Warmel. I'm not sure on the pronunciation of her last name. And for all intents and purposes, he said that his first conversation that he ever had with Ronald was a little odd. He was talking about seeing people in the trees behind his house. And as time went on, he began blaring loud music at all hours of the night. Another neighbor that lived next door, Aaron Gaskell, saw Ronald beat all the windows out of a vehicle in his driveway with a 2x4. And a rowdy crowd of people seemed to congregate around Ross's house. And rumors started that he was actually running a crack house. Local people became so reluctant to pass by his house that the school bus stop was actually moved to accommodate residents in the area. So activities for young people on Grand Manan Island were in short supply, and idleness, of course, breeds trouble, and also presented an opportunity for drug abuse. More and more people believed that there was sufficient evidence that Ross was dealing crack and selling it to school-aged children. Complaints were made to the police, and they didn't fall on deaf ears. There's a small RCMP detachment that polices Grand Manan, or at least it did at that time. I'm not sure if that's still the case. I believe it is. And they did obtain a warrant to search Ronald's premises. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough evidence to formally charge him with any drug crimes. Just switch the needles here again. Also, if you notice my first stitch on each needle, I tend to pull those super tight for anyone who's actually watching what I'm doing. And the reason I do that is because it helps avoid something called laddering in your stitches between the needles, so that there's no gap where my stitches cross over at the point where the needles are connected, right in here, so they all look even. That's why I pull my first stitch there so tightly. Anywho, back to the story. So, following that search of his premises, Ronald became more brazen towards the people in the community. He acted like he was outside the law, that he was a big-time gangster. And this image he created for himself was further bolstered by plenty of visitors to the island from the mainland. And in order to get to the island, you have to take a ferry. You can't just drive onto the island. So many residents started noticing they had items stolen, such as power tools from their property. And it was believed that Ross and the people that were visiting him might be responsible. People thought that the stolen property was being used by Ross as payment for drugs, and that the property was then being fenced on the mainland by these people that were coming to visit Ross. One of Ross's regular visitors was a man named Terry Irvine from St. John, New Brunswick, not to be confused with St. John's, Newfoundland. So Terry drove a GMC Jimmy, and supposedly he was bringing drugs onto the island and taking the stolen goods off of the island with each visit. Thefts on the island continued to increase, and so did people's hatred towards Ross, and that's when things really started to get out of hand. By Canada Day, which is the 1st of July, local residents had had enough. Terry Irvine's Jimmy was actually set on fire in Ross's driveway on Cedar Street. No one was injured, but the vehicle was damaged beyond repair. And Ross blamed Carter Foster, who lived across the street. But Foster said that he wasn't even on the island at the time that the fire started. So Ronald Ross's temper grew, and he threatened Carter and his girlfriend Sarah, telling them that they should sleep with one eye open because a flaming ball of fire was going to come through their window. After he made those threats, Ross went out later that same evening and set up a huge pile of wooden pallets on his front yard near the street. The pile was topped off with a couple of propane tanks. And Ross then lit the pallets on fire. Carter, believing that he was going to end up blowing up the whole neighborhood, called the police. The RCMP arrived and the fire was put out, and Ross tried to explain what happened. He also told police that there had been a community meeting which had taken place, and people had been discussing the fact that they had decided to burn him out of his own house. Talk of threats of residents burning someone out wasn't new. Actually, as far back as 1839, the Episcopal Church on Grand Manan had been destroyed by fire by residents who were against the bishop and the rector of the parish. So over the next few weeks, various accusations were exchanged between Ross and other residents of the community. Ross claimed at one point that someone threw a propane tank through his window of his house. And then rumors also started regarding Ross having associates of his from the mainland come in to avenge the burning of Terry Irvine's GMC Jimmy. People said Ross was associated with the Hells Angels. And some rumors were a little more specific. A resident by the name of Larry Marshall had heard that Ross was bringing in people to burn 8 to 10 houses in the area, with Carter Foster's residence at the top of the list. Now, Larry's brother hung around with Ross, so there was a general feeling that this rumor had some validity to it. And these people were supposed to arrive on Friday, July 21st. So this would be 3 weeks after that Canada Day episode. Calls to police about Ross were not acted on swiftly, but the RCMP did start making patrols and checking vehicles that were coming over on the Grand Manan ferry. As they and after they were checking vehicles, they also did a patrol near Cedar Street. And they could see that there was about 30 to 40 people gathered in Carter Foster's front yard. Now, many of these people that had gathered there had been victims of thefts on the island. One of the officers did stop and have a chat with Carter. He informed him that the rumor of a gang coming to the island simply wasn't true. Terry Irvine's new vehicle a white GMC Yukon, had been stopped coming onto the island by the RCMP, and there were only 3 men on board and no weapons. So Foster said, well, if the crowd across the street started something, they would finish it. But it was kind of just a, veiled threat at that point. Carter's girlfriend, Sarah, put her dog and her journals, some family documents and photographs into her car. She feared if things got out of hand and Ross's house was burnt, hers would be burnt in retaliation. So even with all the tough talk, concerns, the crowd in the yard seemed more like they were attending a community barbecue than gathering a violent mob. As the evening wore on and it was getting dark, later accounts of what happened once the trouble started were imprecise, but the testimony that was given goes something like this. People on both sides, stitch slipped instead of knitting. There we go. People on both sides of Cedar Street were drinking. The crowd on Foster's side of the street greatly outnumbered the less than dozen people that were at Ross's house. And people on Foster's side were seen with baseball bats, and someone on Ross's side was seen with a knife attached to the end of a long pole. Shortly after midnight, Carter Foster and a couple people moved into the street to confront the men that came out of Ronald Ross's house. Foster yelled at him, you're going to get off the effing island. And then he and Ross started to fight, like in the middle of the street. Foster seemed to be winning, and he had Ross in a chokehold when someone fired shots. And there were shots fired from Ross's house. Foster let go of Ross. He ran into his house to get his rifle, and then he climbed up onto his roof and started shooting at Terry Irvine's Yukon that was parked in Ross's driveway. He also shot at the porch light and continued to shoot the vehicle in order to disable it and prevent Ross's people from leaving. People on Foster's side also fired off rocket flares and pistol flares. The gunfire exchange lasted about 5 to 10 minutes, and miraculously, no one was hit with a bullet. However, Ronald Ross was struck in the leg by a flare. At some point during the altercation, someone phoned the police. But by the time the 3 officers arrived, the shooting had stopped and there was no one left out in the street. Later that night, some fights broke out, but officers had trouble breaking them up. Both Ross and Terry Irvine were beaten up. A couple of people from Foster's side decided to go around the back of Ross's house, and they poured some fuel around and lit it. Flames shot up the back wall, and people inside began to run out the front door. The fire department arrived, but they arrived to people shouting, "Let it burn," and rocks were being thrown at the firefighting equipment. Like, these people were nuts. The fire was contained, and Ross and his friends were escorted away by police for their safety. Things at that point seemed to calm down. It quieted down quite a bit. But that didn't last for long. Somewhere between 4:30 and 5 a.m., there were explosions from inside Ross's house, and it burst into flames. The fire department once again headed over, but when they arrived at Cedar Street, they encountered a pickup truck parked across the street, blocking entry. Once that obstruction was cleared, the fire truck was further blocked by a group of people standing across the road, linking hands. By the time the firefighters actually arrived at the house, it was too late. The house was completely destroyed. So the Crown prosecutor moved swiftly to lay charges to set an example that mob rule would not be tolerated. The police could not determine who was responsible for the fire that destroyed Ross's home, but two men, Michael Small and Lloyd Bainbridge, were charged with starting the fire earlier in the night. And another three men, Carter Foster, Matthew Lambert, and Greg Guthrie, were charged for participating in the shootout. Ross was also charged with the same firearms violations and for threatening to firebomb the house of Carter Foster and Sarah Wormel. The other residents of Grand Manan rejected the notion that Foster and his buddies were criminals. They actually put a sign up at the ferry terminal that said, "Free our heroes." Red ribbons were put around town as a sign of solidarity to the group now locally known as the Boys. A criminal defense lawyer, David Lutz, went to Grand Manan, and he asked about the possibility of representing the boys. He informed the residents he would probably need about $20,000 as a retainer. So after he had a meeting there with the town and he left on the ferry the following day, a man knocked on the window of David's car and handed him an envelope with cash and checks equaling about $20,000. The town continued fundraising for the boys by doing bake sales, selling t-shirts, and they had several different fundraisers to pay for legal fees. The court heard about 2 weeks' worth of evidence before the jury deliberated. The verdict? Well, the jury found those who admitted to shooting guns not guilty. The judge backed up their finding, saying that the law doesn't require someone to run into the woods if they are being attacked. So basically, they weren't found guilty because they were simply defending themselves or retaliating, I guess, because they were already under attack at that point. Small and Bainbridge were found guilty of arson. They were sentenced to 1 year house arrest, and they had to pay $5,000 each in fines to Ross. Lambert was found guilty of dangerous use of a firearm, and he was sentenced to 6 months of house arrest. Carter Foster was found guilty of improper storage of a firearm and was sentenced to 6 months house arrest. And Guthrie was found not guilty at all. To my knowledge, from what I found, Ross did not return to Grand Manan. He was found guilty of uttering threats regarding the firebombing, and he was sentenced to 4.5 months of house arrest, which he served in Nova Scotia. Later in 2008, he pled guilty to other charges of assaulting his girlfriend at the time, and he was sentenced to pay a $500 fine. And in 2009, Ronald Ross actually sold crack to an undercover police officer. He was charged and convicted of the offense, and this time he was sentenced to 2 years in a federal penitentiary. Well, that's about all the information I have on the Grand Manan Five. I hope you managed to get some crafting done while listening to this week's episode. I thought this was actually quite an interesting story. I managed to get my sock a couple rows closer to completion of the leg. Thank you so much for stopping by and spending time listening to my crime stories. Please give my video a like. Feel free to subscribe so you'll see any upcoming content. I will include details about this week's project in the drop-down box below, and I will also leave a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you again in a couple weeks.